I am so happy to be with you this evening. This is such a special occasion. It's our opportunity to present the university lecture. This is one of the really exciting things that we do each year, which is to choose a speaker who represents the best of what we do. And so I want to welcome you to the 2026 University Lecture, which will be given by my esteemed colleague, Dr. McKee. So we have been doing this lecture for quite a while. It was established in 1950 to honor members of the Boston University faculty who are engaged in outstanding research. And over the years, we have covered so many topics, an array of disciplines and different types of research. And so tonight is really no different. But someone asked me, how is the speaker selected? Well, it is selected by a broad cross-section of the university, and we get a number of recommendations. And while their topics cover many, many subject matters, each of our lecturers shares a common commitment to scholarly excellence and inquiry and discovery, which is really the hallmark of Boston University. And so you have the honor this evening, and we have the honor of hearing from Dr. McKee, who is really one of Boston University's true visionary leaders. She is a William Fairfield Warren Distinguished Professor of Neurology and Pathology. You might have noticed the calls for the William Fairfield Warren professors has gone out again today, and so keep that in mind. And she is the director of the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, the director of the Boston University CTE Center, and the director of the Neuropathology Service at the VA in Boston. Dr. McKee's work is truly pioneering. She established that repetitive head impacts, such as those experienced during contact sports, by athletes, during military service, members or victims of domestic violence, all of these things can cause chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE. She also created the Unite Brain Bank, and this is the largest brain bank focused on the long-term effects of brain trauma. This is the largest in the world. So Anne has truly been a pioneer in cutting-edge science, and this past year, the NIH awarded her team a $15 million grant for research into how to diagnose CTE during one's lifetime. And what sets her apart is that she not only is a premier scientist, but she wants to create a better world. And so, to quote from Wired magazine, Anne is on a quest to save humanity's brain. And her research and partnerships that she has forged with like-minded people represent that. She's raised awareness of the adverse effects of head trauma in sports, and especially among young people. So this past week, the week before, I had the opportunity to give an address from the stage. I think it was the stage, but up there. And what I talked about was the idea of convergent research, and I used this long-term vision that we would be the global destination of discovery, education, human connection, an epicenter where disciplines, communities, and realities merge, and visionary thinkers unite to create transformative experiences and solutions for the world's greatest challenges. And so I love the fact that we're now able to talk about Anne's Interdisciplinary Center, because the CTE is truly working in this way. It is an incredible training environment within the Chobani and Avedisian School of Medicine. We have faculty that are leading clinical trials, clinical research, human brain bank studies. They are investigators who are involved in national and international collaborations to further the world's knowledge on CTE, Alzheimer's, ALS, PTSD, TBI, and other neurologic conditions. And the center boasts so many partnerships with organizations like the Boston Medical Center, the VA Boston Health Center, the University of Notre Dame's Football Steering Committee, the Concussion Legacy Foundation, Mount Sinai's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and the University of California, San Francisco Memory and Aging Center. And I could go on. So people like Anne have already laid the foundation for Boston University's bright future as a guiding light in all that is possible at universities, especially when we partner across field and industry. So Anne, I cannot wait to hear your ideas and your presentation this evening. Anne, please join me, and please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, for this great honor. President Gilliam, Provost Waters, and the university, I am so honored that you selected me for the university lecture this year. And also, President Gilliam, thank you for your guidance during these tumultuous times regarding science, intellectual pursuit, and academic freedom. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm not going to focus on the science of CTE. This is unusual for me. That's my usual lecture. But instead, I'm going to take this opportunity to discuss my personal path and scientific journey that led to a career focusing on CTE and post-traumatic neurodegeneration. I have been written about many times by others, and tonight is my chance to tell you my version of this story. I did not get here alone. I could never have gotten here on my own. This has been a team effort from the very beginning. I have had a close-knit team of investigators, which has grown substantially over the years. They have been with me every step of the way and are responsible for the large body of work that we have done on CTE. It does take a village to change a world. CTE was, for me, an unexpected calling that came late in my career, in my mid-50s, that changed my life forever. I never expected to take this journey. I never expected to become a neuropathologist or to study CTE. I didn't say to myself as a child, "Oh, I want to dissect dead people's brains for a living." And yet, that is what I do. So I'm going to start out with the basics of our knowledge about CTE. CTE is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that is caused in part by repetitive head injuries. CTE is a pathological diagnosis that is made after death by finding the pathognomonic lesion and the distinctive tau pathology in the brain tissue. The clinical syndrome associated with CTE is called traumatic encephalopathy syndrome, or TES. And at this point in time, we are unable to diagnose CTE in the living. But that is something that we are making huge strides towards changing, and we're hoping that we'll be able to diagnose it in living people in the next few years. So I'm going to tell you about my childhood. I grew up in a place called Appleton, Wisconsin. And I was the fifth child. I was born late in my family's lives, in my parents' lives, and unexpectedly. Or as my brothers and sisters like to say, I was a mistake. My four brothers were almost exactly 2 years apart, and I'm sure my mom and dad thought they were finished when they had 4. But I came along after a 7-year pause. Not everyone in the family was so thrilled that I was born. Especially my brothers Bob and Chuck, who were less than excited about having a little sister. My brothers were closest in age to me, and I spent a lot of time with them. I like to say that I grew up at the mercy of my brothers, who predictably teased and tortured me along the way, but they taught me a valuable lesson that came in handy as I got a little older. They taught me how to be tough and they taught me how to stand up for myself even when you're outnumbered and outsized. They were football players. Football was a major part of my childhood. Even as a young toddler, I was taught how to play football. My dad played football in college at Grinnell, and I knew that he had knocked out some teeth playing football because as long as I knew him, he wore a bridge. We lived in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is 25 miles from Green Bay, Wisconsin. That's where the visiting team stays when they play the Green Bay Packers. And football and the Green Bay Packers are a religion in my hometown. I was raised in the Vince Lombardi era, and the Green Bay Packers, like Bart Starr, Paul Hornung, Willie Wood, Jim Taylor, were a huge part of my childhood. They were my childhood heroes. My father was my biggest champion. He was a research scientist at the Institute of Paper Chemistry and the inventor of many patents that had to do with paper and packaging. He spent a lot of time with me because we were both early risers, and I often visited his research lab. My father felt I had great things in me and never once thought my sex was a handicap. My father thought I could do anything I put my mind to. So I decided to go to medical school when I was in college. It was the Vietnam War. I was an activist, and I wanted to do something to make the world a better place. So I followed my brother Chuck to Case Western Reserve School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio. Case was very proud of our incoming class because we were 20% women, and that was the highest it had ever been. From there, I went on to Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital, where I did 2 residencies, first in internal medicine, and then discovering my love for the brain and the central nervous system, I did a second residency in neurology under the world-renowned Morris Victor and his wife, the world-renowned neuropathologist, Dr. Betty Banker. Both Betty Banker and Dr. Victor trained at Boston City Hospital and told story after story about the colleagues, the great colleagues that they had encountered there. We were taught neurology and neuropathology case by case, using weekly clinical pathological case conferences. Every week, a case would be presented clinically to the residents and faculty. A heated discussion of the clinical differential diagnosis would ensue, followed by a presentation of the pathology, considered the gold standard of diagnosis. Our third year was spent entirely in neuropathology under Dr. Banker, who you should know was a very demanding taskmaster. She had extremely high standards, and none of the residents, including myself, ever lived up to her expectations. So I was extremely happy to graduate and leave and go to a clinical fellowship in dementia. And I got there at the UMass Hospital, and I realized that I missed neuropathology. When I found that I loved looking at the brain. I loved that what neuropathology told you about why a patient acted or thought or behaved the way they did. And I loved that it was the final answer. You could debate about the clinical diagnosis, but the neuropathological analysis was the ground truth. I asked Dr. Victor and Banker if they would recommend me to a neuropathology program, and they recommended me to Mass General Hospital with E.P. Richardson and C. Miller Fisher, Joseph B. Martin, Raymond D. Adams, and Vern Cavanis. And there we again continued to learn neurology and neuropathology case by case through the clinical pathological weekly lessons. And little did I know, this process of learning these diseases was to become the foundation of my scientific life. I stayed at Mass General for 9 years. I worked at the Alzheimer's Center brain bank there, and I thought my career was going to be focused on Alzheimer's disease and tau pathology. But in 1994, I moved to the VA in Bedford and became an associate professor at BU. And one of the first things we did was establish the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease Center at the Bedford VA. That was the initial site of the BU ADRC. And there I started the brain banks for the BU Alzheimer's Center and eventually the Framingham Heart Study. I began to look meticulously through those brains for the earliest signs of tau, and I used a technique that was the purview of the ancient neuroanatomists. I used large hemispheric slides. And at one point, I looked through the slides of 41 cases of controls and other individuals from the Framingham Heart Study. With these slides, I looked at frontal cortex, the medial temporal cortex, as well as the posterior cortex, and I reported this very unknown finding that the visual association cortex was affected with tau pathology even before the medial temporal lobe, and that was not known previously. But then, as I was looking at cases from the Alzheimer's Center, I came upon a case of Paul Pender. And he was a world-famous boxer in this region. He twice fought Sugar Ray Robinson for the title. And when I looked at his brain, he had anything but Alzheimer's disease. He had the most extraordinary tau pathology that I'd ever seen. The tau circled around vessels, it nestled in the crevices of the brain, it involved nuclei that Alzheimer's disease did not involve. And I had been on expert consensus panels to describe rare tauopathies, rare diseases characterized by tau, and I'd never seen anything like it. And I knew that this was a case of CTE. He had been diagnosed in life with Alzheimer's disease, but he was a case of CTE, and I was fascinated by this disease scientifically. I looked for other cases in boxers. I found one, also diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at the center, but turned out to have CTE. He was also a boxer. And then a few years later, I met Chris Nowinski. And Chris Nowinski was probably the only Harvard graduate that ever went on to be a professional wrestler. He also had played football for Harvard College. And he had had a number of concussions. He had some difficulty, and he was a smart guy. He wanted to know what the long-term effects of these head injuries that he was sustaining in the wrestling ring. And so he walked into my office one day. He had been referred by Bob Stern, who worked at the Alzheimer's Center, and he asked if I would be willing to look at the brains of football players. And so I thought, oh my God, football, I'm a huge fan. I have such a passionate interest for football, and the brain and CTE is another interest of mine, more scientific, but this was an unbelievable opportunity, and I said yes. And so right after that, we started the Boston University Center for the Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy. That was 2008. That was Bob Stern, Bob Cantu, a well-known neurosurgeon from Emerson Hospital, Chris Nowinski, and myself. We had the support of Karen Antman, Dean Antman. We went to her to ask for seed money to start this center, and maybe unlike what you might expect, she said, yes, I will give you some seed money. She will give us some seed money if I can go to all the other departments in the medical school and see if they will match her gift. So we did that, and actually quite a few of them anteed in. And so we started the BU CTE Center at Boston University. We also needed a brain bank, and those brain banks were at the VA. And so I needed the support of the brain bank because a brain bank requires millions of dollars in infrastructure to run. There's huge requirements in HVAC and freezers. It's really quite substantial. And Michael Charnas and Terry Keene have been staunch supporters of this work since the very beginning. And they have supported this work and provided VA funding to support all the infrastructure of the brain bank, which, as you might expect, has expanded exponentially over the last 18 years. I also needed more help with neuropathology, and when I asked Michael Charnas if he would support a new position as a full-time neuropathologist. He said yes, and we were able to hire Tor Steen, who continues to be my partner to this day. We started the brain bank. It was the only brain bank that we knew of that was studying the long-term consequences of brain trauma. And we have collected, at this point, over 1,750 brains from athletes, military veterans, and others exposed to repetitive impacts. This is by far the largest brain bank in the world. My first NFL case was John Grimsley. He came in 2008. He was 45 years old when he died. He'd played in the NFL for 9 years. And at the age of 40, his wife of many years noticed some problems. He was having difficulty remembering things. He was having difficulty multitasking. And he died while cleaning his gun. He accidentally shot himself in the stomach, even though he was employed as an expert hunter and guidesman. And Virginia, his wife, felt that the accident had been a result of his inability to keep things organized. Anyway, when I looked at the brain of John Grimsley, I saw this enormous and extraordinary tau pathology, the likes of which I had only seen in the boxers like Paul Pender, and it was shocking to me. I cannot tell you how much this shocked me. I was a huge football fan. I watched football a lot, and those helmets and those uniforms, they looked invincible. They don't complain of head trauma. You don't see them holding their head during the game. They don't have any bleeding. You think they're unscathed. But it turns out that repetitive head injury, if sustained long enough, and if the injuries and if the forces are high enough, it puts football players and other athletes at risk for CTE. So our first publication was in 2009. I reviewed the world's literature on CTE so that I thoroughly understood the disease, and I reported those first 3 cases that I had, John Grimsley and the 2 boxers. And let me just say, the world was not prepared for that particular publication. A month later, I was asked to go before the NFL MTBI committee, and they invited me to the Park Avenue to present my findings. Now, they had a reputation for not being on board with the adverse effects of concussions or any head injury. So I asked them if I could bring Chris Nowinski along as sort of my bodyguard, and they agreed he could come, but only if if he didn't speak. So he could come, but he was not allowed to say anything. Anyway, when I went to the MTBI committee, I had only 4 NFL players. So it was at the beginning of this journey. And I showed them what I thought was extremely convincing neuropathology, remembering that neuropathology is the gold standard of human diagnosis. And I was met with deep, deep denial, lots of skepticism, and mockery. They found my work sort of entertaining, and they kept wanting to see if someone else could come in the room, because clearly I didn't know what I was talking about. Anyway, about a month later, I was asked to testify before Congress for the NFL Player Head Injuries Committee. I had never testified in front of Congress. I didn't even know what congressional testimony was. I had to look it up. And I found out that you had to, use your experience to give your honest medical opinion. And I was asked to testify what I thought about head injuries as a risk to NFL players' medical and neurological state. So at that point, I didn't have that many cases. It was early on in the study. I had 5 NFL players. I had a National Hockey League player. I had a college football player, and I had one 18-year-old, a high school football player, and they all had CTE. So I had to ask myself, is this a coincidence or is this something important? And so I looked back. This was a day of reckoning. I had to look back at my experience. Clearly, we needed more cases and more data. I only had a few cases, but I did have decades of experience examining brains for tau, including those 41 Framingham Heart Study participants. And I was certain this was not a consequence of normal aging. This was not normal to have this pattern of tau. Now, it wasn't a matter of my not seeing it because I didn't look for it. I had looked for it, and I had not found it. I also knew it wasn't Alzheimer's disease or any other strange tauopathy you can name because I'd been on these panels for diagnosing rare tauopathies, and I'd been looking at Alzheimer's disease for 20 years. So I was certain I wasn't misdiagnosing a different disease. So I decided that this was the truth. I trusted myself. This wasn't a set of experiments that I'd somehow misinterpreted. This wasn't a statistical data that I'd miscalculated. I had brain tissue under the microscope. Now, I was alone. I was the only neuropathologist at that time at the Bedford VA. I looked behind me for someone else to testify to Congress, but there was no one. My team, the CSTE, with Bob Cantu, Bob Stern, and Chris Nowinski, none of them were neuropathologists. So this was on me. And I thought, if CTE is a risk for football players, contact sport athletes, even amateur athletes like the 18-year-old Eric Pelly, I thought the world needed to know. And I decided to speak up to prevent this from happening to more athletes and future athletes. So all truths begin as blasphemies. This was a paradigm shift. The whole concept of post-traumatic neurodegeneration was revolutionary. The idea that asymptomatic blows to the head, repetitive head impacts, or what we call RHI, most of which are asymptomatic. So there's a lot of focus on concussion in this, but the only difference between a non-concussive injury and a concussion is whether or not they cause symptoms. So a concussion causes symptoms, and we recognize those. But for every concussion, there are 400 asymptomatic blows to the head that are of equal magnitude or even greater severity. It's the cumulative effect of all those hits to the head that cause risk for CTE. Human nature resists new ideas or insights, especially if the new ideas threaten society's culture, economy, or disrupt fanatical devotion, such as sports and sports culture. So this idea, this paradigm shift, was hugely unpopular. The critics of my work claimed that my clinical pathological case studies were too observational, that they lacked graphs and statistics. They were a misinterpretation of normal age-related tau pathology, or they were just a complete construct of my imagination. Now, I'd like to point out that major scientific discoveries have been made through observation. In 1796, Edward Jenner noted that milkmaids who had cowpox rarely got smallpox, and that was led to the first vaccine for smallpox. In 1822, Mendel, observing pea plants and dominant and recessive traits, laid the groundwork for genetics. In 1882, Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution through observation of wildlife on the Galapagos Island. And in 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed that mold inhibited bacterial growth in a petri dish, and that led to the discovery of penicillin. But the one character that I didn't want to be like was Semmelweis, a Hungarian obstetrician. He cared for women in the maternity ward with puerperal fever. And in that day, the doctors did autopsies on their patients. So if a woman with puerperal fever died, they did the autopsy. Midwives also cared for for women in the ward with puerperal fever, but they never did autopsies. And what Semmelweis noticed was that the mortality rate of the doctors delivering those women was much higher than that of the midwives. So he introduced a policy for the doctors for hand washing. And the physicians who thought highly of themselves sharply rebuked this idea. They decided not to renew his position at the hospital, and they blocked all positions in the city of Vienna. So he ended up going back to Hungary, where he watched as his theory was debunked in medical lectures and in publications, and he died at the age of 47, having been committed to a mental institution. So my strategy was going to be slightly different. I decided the only way I was going to turn the world to agree with me was to publish more papers, add more brains to the brain bank, publish in better and better scientific journals, get grants, get more people to do this work. And this was a paper with Lee Goldstein where we reported blast injuries in veterans can lead to CTE, and the CTE can look exactly like that in contact sport athletes. So this isn't something restricted to athletes. Anyone who gets hit in the head or that has blast injuries can develop this disease. And that led finally to the publication in Brain. I finally had 68 cases of CTE. It wasn't a magical number, but I had, remember, autopsy analysis is cross-sectional. You only get the moment of time that the person died. But I found that if I had 68 cases, and if I lined them up, I could see what was the earliest stage of CTE. I could see how it marched through the nervous system and became a very profound, severe disease affecting widespread regions of the brain stem, and even the spinal cord. So we reported those findings. We presented we proposed criteria for the diagnosis of CTE and how to stage pathological severity. We had control subjects who weren't exposed to RHI, who didn't develop the disease. And we laid out the differences between CTE and Alzheimer's disease, which had been largely confused. And this is just some of the work showing the CTE lesion and the pathological staging of severity. So there was a lot of backlash to this particular journal article. Most notably was CTE is not a real disease. The Concussion in Sports group, which is called CISG, which is an international group of sports medicine physicians and researchers who work to analyze the world's scientific literature for the evaluation, management, and prevention of sports-related concussion. And those members include members of the NFL, the NHL, FIFA, World Rugby. These leaders denied that CTE was a real condition. They said it was a misdiagnosis of aging or Alzheimer's disease. Paul McCrory, who was a leading voice in the CISG, said it's fair to say there's increasing skepticism around the world as to whether this condition actually exists or not. And that may seem strange and provocative to say, because if you listen to the media, you get a different story. This fight about whether CTE was real continued for at least the next 10 years. I had never had this problem with any other disorder, any rare disorder that only affected a handful of people. I never was told it wasn't real, but CTE was not real. And the other thing people said about my study was that I was destroying football. Actually, I personally was destroying football. I was a threat to sports culture, and the business of sports. The assault was brutal. I was the scientist, the messenger. I was challenging the norm and disrupting shared beliefs. There was outrage. There was a distinctive gendered subtext. By positioning me as the destroyer of cultural institutions, critics used my gender to frame my research as a crusade instead of a scientific investigation. I was labeled emotional, sensational, an advocate, not a scientist. There was dismissal and there was humiliation. I was the woman who would destroy football. And a pervasive comment that I got in many, many audiences was, "Who do I think I am?" So there were some valid criticisms. Most notably, there weren't any longitudinal prospective trials. Now, you can only diagnose this disease at autopsy. So to do a longitudinal prospective trial, you would have to carry it forward for at least 60 years until the person died, and we would do an autopsy and see if they had CTE. So I didn't want to wait that long. People were dying. People were suffering. I thought we needed action earlier than that. But my critics said we need to wait for these longitudinal prospective trials. And the Concussion in Sport group invited me to Zurich to present my studies. And in this round table of most of the leaders of that group, they told me point blank that they had looked at my papers and they found it very poor science. There were also criticisms about causality. We did not know for sure what was causing CTE, but the common denominator to all these cases was a long history of getting hit in the head. And so there was circumstantial evidence that it was related to the duration and the number of hits to the head. But we hadn't adequately looked at other things like substance use or alcohol or anabolic steroids. We did know that none of those substances caused a tau pathology on their own, but it was possible that those other factors made the disease worse. In 2014, I got a grant from the NINDS of $12 million, and that was a lifesaver in terms of the work. We then drew a consensus panel together, and the panel agreed, using my original criteria, that there was a set of pathologic criteria to diagnose CTE. They said there was a pathognomonic lesion for CTE, and they also said it was a distinct disease, unlike any other tauopathy. Right after that, I was sued or subpoenaed by the NHL. The NHL wanted me to give them all the records, all the slides, all the photographs, all the emails, all the anything on every case I had ever touched. This was a demand that, if I had fulfilled it, would have shuttered the lab for years. And I did write in defense that it threatens the foundation on which science thrives. The NHL compared my work to a fraudulent scientist, and quite honestly, this was quite disruptive to the lab. And then the following year, I was invited to give my research to the American Society for Sports Medicine in 2015. What I didn't realize, but I was beginning to suspect, because it wasn't entirely unprecedented, they had set me up. So this was a large audience, about 1,500 people, and I was set up as the only person to talk about the adverse effects of hits to the head. I was followed by probably my main critic, a man named Rudy Castellani, a neuropathologist who had made his career on bashing my work. And he said at the time, if I have as much tau in my brain as Mike Webster, who was the original NFL player diagnosed with CTE, then I will be aging successfully. And he was followed by Chris Randolph, who later wrote a paper called CTE is Not a Real Disease. And Chris Randolph not only talked about how CTE wasn't a disease, but he told me in this conference that I was violating my Hippocratic oath by talking about CTE. I was scaring people to death. I was encouraging them to take their own lives, and I needed to stop. So I didn't get a chance for any rebuttal. That wasn't how it was set up. It was a design where I was the entertainer for a large body of people who did not believe in my research and thought it was relatively funny that I was sort of ridiculed in this manner. But if I had a chance to speak to them, I would like to say there is a difference between alarm, telling people about a disease and creating fear. This is a preventable disease. I raise the alarm so we can change how we play sports, so we can change how we do things. When you deal with death every week, every year, you talk to grieving families, multiple grieving families, every week of your life, month after month, year after year, you ask yourself and you ask them, why aren't we doing more? Why are we letting this happen? You can't just blow this off and say it doesn't exist. You can't kill the messenger and make it all go away. So then we had this paper in JAMA, which was a very important paper. It raised a lot of positive publicity for our work, but it had some very scary statistics. 110 out of 111 NFL players with CTE, and a high percentage of college players. This was never a prevalence study, it was a population study, and most football players played at high levels. But what we did see in this study was that people who play football for many years develop CTE much more often than those that don't. Critics talked about the selection bias of brain bank studies, and that was true. We acknowledged it in the paper. But some of the newspapers that followed this study had comments like, the media attention to this issue continues to outweigh meaningful results. Why does McKee make sweeping assertions? Football is good for you, deception is not. Other scientists do not replicate McKee's finding. That's a major problem. Saying McKee found CTE in all but one football corpse may say something about football, but it might say something about McKee. Luckily, at the end of that year, I was Bostonian of the Year. And I have to tell you, that was thrilling for me. It was the first time in a while that I had gotten positive recognition for this work. So it was a huge relief. And that was followed very shortly by being named to Time 100, one of the most influential people in the world. We had, shortly after that, we got the brain of Aaron Hernandez, who I'm sure many of you in the audience know, and we found that he had stage 3 CTE. But then that was followed by the publication of the book Brainwashed, The Bad Science Behind CTE and the Plot to Destroy Football. And that book was written by Merrill Hodge, a former NFL player for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Peter Cummings, who is a neuropathologist at Boston University. Yes, this is my colleague writing this book. And here's what the book says. The science behind football and CTE is mostly garbage. These are quotes. Selection bias makes the infamous 110 out of 111 brains almost worthless. Science that's just plain terrible. These perivascular lesions are man-made. Yeah, I'm a fraud as well as wrong. And the Twitter feed alone is a pro-McKee anti-football propaganda tool. So after that, I was very relieved with this publication in 2019 from a completely different set of investigators showing that CTE tau was different than all other tauopathies. It had a unique fold. It had a different structure than Alzheimer's disease or any other tauopathy. And shortly after that, Jesse Mez and Dan Danshavar in our lab accounted for all degrees of selection bias and showed that there was a dose-response relationship between the number of hits to the head and risk for CTE. In fact, for football players, if you played 2.6 years, for every 2.6 years, you doubled your risk for CTE. And this was followed by another paper in 2022 that found that selection bias actually minimized the risk, that the actual risk was higher than we were finding. By then, we had 1,300 brain donors into the brain bank. We got the brain of, we got the interest of a Hall of Famer who was alive, Nick Bonaconti, but he was suffering, and he wanted to come to BU to be examined. And he came, and he was examined by David Greer and my colleagues, and he was thought to have CTE. And so Nick, because he wanted to help future athletes, he pledged his brain to the BU CTE Center, and a year or two later, we had it. Then I was elected to the Sammys. I got a Sammy Award thanks to my friends at the VA and Terry Keene. And there were more studies showing that CTE in community banks was quite rare. And that made our prevalence, our population studies finding, this very extraordinarily high percentage in athletes even more exceptional. And then in 2022, my colleague Chris Nowinski used the Bradford Hill criteria to prove causation. And in 2022, the NIH concluded that CTE is caused in part by repetitive head impacts. So things were starting to go our way. I reported 2 years ago, I wanted to look at the young athletes, the athletes who had died before the age of 30, and their brains were in our brain bank. There were 152 of these young athletes, and we found CTE in 41%. Most of them played amateur sports for high schools and colleges. There was one woman who played collegiate soccer. And most of these individuals started playing at a very young age, as young as 6. And we found that nearly all of those with CTE had mild CTE, but they were young, that was to be expected. The ones that had CTE were about 4 years older than those who didn't, but we're talking about comparing a 25-year-old to a 21-year-old. And the ones who developed CTE played more football than those that did not. And then very recently, John Cherry and Morgan Butler in Nature, just a few months ago, reported that there are multiple changes in the brain after repetitive head impacts that precede CTE, and that those correlate with the number of head hits. They found that there's neuronal loss in the cortex of the brain in young people that get hit in the head, and they found it correlated with the amount of inflammation. So we need to change the way we play sports. We need to take athletes and veterans and their mental health concerns very seriously. We need to listen to them, ask about their sports and military history, treat the symptoms, and provide longitudinal care. This work has a huge emotional toll. As I mentioned, Torstein and I look at each case, and the cases are discussed in a consensus conference where the clinicians give their input. But after that, we talk to the families by Zoom, and we talk about our findings, and we hear from the families about what they're concerned about. We have nearly 1,000 brain donors with a diagnosis of CTE, and each death is a tragedy, whether they have CTE or not. So imagine the emotional toll of dealing with 1,750 brain donors over the last 18 years. And I want to show you a particular case this is a family. It's Jeff and Katie Leslie. They came to see me last year, and they spent 2 days wanting to know more about CTE. And the reason they wanted to know more about CTE is one day in the spring of 2021, a man named Philip Adams, a former NFL player, randomly came to their house with 2 semi-automatic machine guns and shot Jeff's parents and their 2 children, their only 2 children, because the grandparents were caring for the children. And his brain, he ultimately shot himself, and his brain, we had an opportunity to evaluate, and he had stage 2 CTE. So this is why we do this work. We do it for Ada and Noah, we do it for Barbara and Leslie, and we do it for Philip Adams and all the athletes and military veterans who are suffering from CTE and who will get CTE if we don't change things. Over the last 18 years, we've done amazing work, and I know it's late, I'm not going to go through all the things that my team has done, but we have over 200 publications, and many of those have graphs and statistics, just to remind you. And we're working on quite a number of things. We've done amazing things over the 18 years. What do we still need to know? We need to be able to diagnose this in life, and we are working on that. We're working on brain scans to identify tau. We're working on blood biomarkers for CTE. And so someday, and we hope very soon, we'll be able to tell if a person has CTE. Once we can diagnose it, we can treat it, and we can start clinical trials. There are treatments for tauopathies, and we can try some of those treatments in CTE. We do need longitudinal prospective trials, and those are started. We have Diagnose and the HIT study. The clinical arm of the CTE Center is doing that. And we have done more prevalence studies, and those are actually in review. And I'd love to tell you about them tonight, but they haven't been accepted for publication yet. But I think you'll find that CTE is much more common than you might recognize. It's not a rare disease. It affects millions of Americans. So CTE is an entirely preventable disease that it can affect even young athletes playing amateur sports. We could dramatically lower the risk for CTE if we made some simple changes to sports. No heading in soccer could reduce CTE by 50%. No tackle football before 14. No contact, no tackling in football practice, like the pros do, would reduce the risk for CTE in high school and college athletes. I want to thank all the donor families who've made this work possible, and as you can see, some of them are very young. I want to thank my team. People that aren't pictured here are Lee Goldstein, John Cherry, and Victor Alvarez. I want to thank my funding sources. I want to thank my family for putting up with me. This has been a roller coaster of a career, and I want to thank you for listening. Thank you. Do I stay up, please?
Okay. So we have a few minutes for questions, and there should be microphones.
How would your advice have changed if you're talking to a parent who wants their kids to develop lifelong habits? So is there anything one can do physically as a child which one can hope to do at age 70? And how would you talk to a parent if they have more confidence pushing their kid for a college scholarship as opposed to maybe if academics doesn't cut it? So how is your advice to parents change when it comes to physical activity in kids?
Well, I can tell you, we definitely want physical activity in our children. Physical activity is the #1 best thing you can do for your brain health. So aerobic exercise, physical fitness, taking care of your body, blood pressure, cholesterol, weight, BMI, all of those things are important to protect your brain. So I'm certainly not an advocate of kids not playing sports. But what I'm an advocate for is kids playing sports and not getting hit in the head. There are many team sports you can play that don't involve hits to the head. And soccer, which a lot of children play, can be played without heading. That is one of the easiest things to change in soccer, and that eliminates most of the collisions and contact. That eliminates most of the hits. Football is a different matter because collision is part of the game, but we can make the game safer by raising the age at which kids start to participate in full contact football, and we can ask them not to hit in practice, which is what the NFL does because they're trying to protect their athletes. But in the high school and college level, they're practicing 5 days a week and hitting every day of the week. It doesn't matter when you start football, except that the earlier you start, the longer your career tends to be. So if you start at 6 and play through high school, you can have a decade or more of head injuries. If you started when you were in high school, you'd have 4 years. So you can limit your exposure by playing later. Other sports have other rules, like ice hockey. But I would encourage parents to consider the lifelong potential of their child. You get one brain, it doesn't renew itself, and you can play lots of team sports without getting hit in the head. And so that's what I would say.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for that talk. It was very inspirational and insightful. My question is, why do you hypothesize that you see CTE in male subjects more than female subjects?
Do I hypothesize that, did you say?
Yes, or just a reasoning
Well,
as to
quite
why.
honestly, most athletes historically have been male. Until Title IX, there were no sports and educational institutions for women. And in the military, too, women have only recently become part of the combat operations. And so there is a delay, right? We need these individuals to age and to get the symptoms of CTE. And we do have women in the brain bank, about, I think it's 7%. So it's low, and we've definitely tried to recruit for women. But we have too few women to say whether the lack of CTE in women is biological or if it's just who we have the opportunity to study. CTE has been described in women. I've had an athlete with CTE. Australia's had a professional Australian rules player with CTE. And there's been women described with CTE who are victims of domestic violence. Now, they're a hard group to examine because you have to agree to brain donation, and that requires the next of kin's consent. So if there's abuse in the home, they are less likely to want to consent. But there are nearly 10 women in the literature, I know it's not much, who have been described with CTE following domestic violence. The difficulty with domestic violence is it isn't as stereotyped as the play of football. Abusers don't do the same thing. There's a lot of asphyxia, a lot of strangulation. There's a lot of other injuries that don't involve hits to the head. So it's more of a mixed bag.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know if in your lab you've looked at perhaps brains and preclinical studies to see if there are any factors or molecules in brains that give some sort of protective capacity or some, refractory nature, like preclinical studies where you assess head trauma to, let's say, outbred animals and see for ones that, do not advance, so to speak, at a certain rate. Is there any positives to look forward to?
Right. So we do not have a great animal model for CTE. I mean, we can model mild repetitive head injury, but we have not seen in mice, who are extremely different from humans. They don't have, convolutions in their brain, which are part of the physics of the injury. So we don't have a good murine or mouse model of CTE. But I can tell you that our studies in humans, because now we have nearly 2,000, it's starting to get to be quite a lot, we know that there's genetic susceptibility, not for CTE, but for the severity of CTE. So some individuals with ApoE4, they tend to get more severe forms of CTE. TMEM106B, which is a gene that regulates inflammation, is more of a mixed bag, but it has some resiliency. So individuals with TMEM106B don't develop the inflammation and the dementia, and not as much tau pathology. So there are some genetics that are related to CTE. We're looking for other factors, lifestyle factors, other exposures, things like toxins in the environment, maybe metals in the field or the paint or other things that these individuals may be exposed to. But we're just beginning to understand some of the nuances of this disease. And certainly, I can show you two people with the exact same exposure. One gets CTE and one does not. So there are other factors.
As the daughter of a dynamic, powerful mother who lost the battle to Alzheimer's, I'm wondering how much of the work that you're doing now is still focused on Alzheimer's? Because I'd love to see you do this for Alzheimer's, because
well, I direct the Alzheimer's Center, and our Alzheimer's Center is focused. We're probably the only Alzheimer's Center in existence. There are about 30, 35 in the country. But we are the only one that are focused on post-traumatic neurodegeneration, meaning after you get hit in the head, you get neurodegenerations. I've told you today about CTE, and that's the most common one. But Parkinson's disease and Lewy body disease is also accelerated after hits to the head, even if you don't get CTE. And we know that some other diseases are accelerated, like something called TDP-43 encephalopathy. Now, that can occur later in life. It's called LATE. That's its acronym. But in CTE, we see it early. And we see it in some athletes even in their 20s with ALS. So we're starting to see that hits to the head can promote multiple neurodegenerations, including an atypical form of Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question? I think we have just one last in the back, and then we have a reception in the back. So last one.
First of all, thank you so much for coming out to this. And a quick question regarding kind of your story. And I do think it's such an amazing one. And for so many people that are kind of like struggling, finding what they want to do, or kind of facing a lot of backlash with whatever they want to do, I was just curious on what do you have to say for people who maybe need to find that extra bit of strength to keep pushing and really make something beautiful happen?
Well, I think you need to try a lot of things. I think you have to be unafraid to try out a lot of things. I did 3 residencies. I thought I wanted to be a pediatric surgeon when I started out in medicine. And so I flipped and flopped and followed my heart, and it was a very circuitous journey. So I would say, keep your eyes open, keep the possibilities wide. And when you find something that resonates with your heart, who you are, follow it, because that'll lead, I think, to a great career.
Dr. McKee, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I love the title. And to the person who asked the last question, that word resilience is really, really important. And so thank you. And thank you for all that you do.
Well, thank you.
It's wonderful.